A wonderful young couple had just been married. They boarded a great cruise ship to celebrate their honeymoon. They went to their room, they changed for dinner. They went to the great dining room aboard the beautiful ship. A maitre d' led them into a spectacular room filled with beautiful crystal chandeliers, large windows overlooking the ocean, tables set like they had never seen in their life. The maitre d' led them over to where they would be eating each meal during the cruise. They were assigned to a table of 4, and as they were approaching the table, they could see the other people who would be seated at the table. They could see them from behind. It was obviously an older man and a young woman. As they went around the table to be seated, they were shocked to see the old man's face, horribly scarred and disfigured. As they sat through dinner, it was so distracting they could barely eat. And so they quickly excused themselves and left the dining room. As they talked about their experience, they said, this time is really for us. This is a time where we're learning to love one another, to really build a bond together. And with that, they reasoned that they would no longer go to the formal dining room. They would just eat something out on the deck. So they skipped breakfast and they skipped lunch. And in the middle of the afternoon, the young woman found them on deck, the woman from their table. She said, I noticed that you didn't come to breakfast this morning or lunch today, and I think I understand what the situation is. I would just like to tell you about the man who sits at the table with me. That is my father. When I was a little girl, there was a fire in my house. My father made it out safely. And when he discovered that I was still trapped inside, he rushed to go back to the burning house, but the firemen grabbed him and held him back, saying there was no hope. But he would not be held back. And he burst into the burning house, and he lifted me out of my bed. He covered me and protected me with his own body and carried me through the flames, sacrificing himself for me. And you see, to me, that old face is the most beautiful face in the world. Sometimes things are not what they seem. Sometimes we're called to go beyond the first impression, to go beyond the conventional wisdom. You see, that's what John's gospel is really all about. Breaking through the lines, crossing into new territory, leaving behind our old way of looking at the world. You think about those words we say at the beginning of worship. We've been saying each Sunday through this series about light coming out of the darkness and life renewed and made new again. John wants us to think about the world in a fundamentally different way. And especially to think about people, the people around us, in a different way. John invites us, as followers of Jesus Christ, to look at the people around us and see them as Christ sees them. That's the purpose for this story in the 4th chapter of the Gospel of John. It begins, and sometimes we don't notice this, but Jesus is in debate with the Pharisees, who are supposed to be the religious authorities of the day. And Jesus is in conversation with them. And they're talking about mighty things and big things and important ideas and great concepts. When Jesus says, sorry, boys, I gotta go. And what he says is surprising to everyone. He says, I have to go to Samaria. Now, there was nobody sitting there in Jerusalem that day that ever wanted to go to Samaria. You see, the Roman province of Palestine was divided into three parts. There was the lower part, Judea, which represented the southern kingdom of Israel. That's where Jerusalem and Bethlehem and those places were. And then at the far top area, the north, there was the Galilee, where Jesus was from and where Jesus would spend most of his time in ministry. But in the middle, there was the area known as Samaria, which is where the bad folk lived, according to the people in Judea and Galilee. You see, way back in Old Testament times, the Babylonians had come along and grabbed a bunch of the Jewish folks out of that land known as Samaria in Jesus' time and had hauled them off into slavery. Eventually, there were a bunch of political changes, and some of them were allowed to come home. But when they came home, they were rejected by their fellow Jews. They were considered impure and unworthy of their nation. And so a good Jew in Judea, say in Jerusalem, if he had to go to Galilee, would go miles and miles out of his way. He would cross the Jordan, go up the side of what we now know as the nation of Jordan, go up the eastern side of the Jordan, and then cross back over to stay out of Samaria. The Samaritans, for their part, didn't like the Jews either. In fact, we know these things about the Samaritans. The Samaritans considered themselves the true inheritors of God's call. They believed that worship should take place on Mount Gerizim, which is right there in the middle of the Roman province of Palestine. Now, that doesn't seem like a big deal to us, but to them it was a huge deal. And they pointed out that Joshua, when he brought the first Israelites into the promised land, went there to call upon the people to let go of their old gods of Egypt and to embrace and follow the one God, Yahweh, the God we know as the God of the Bible. That's where all that happened. And they said, this is the place where you're supposed to come and worship. Further, the Samaritans rejected the lineage of David. The Jews believed that the Messiah would come from the lineage of David. The Samaritans said, take a look at David. What kind of guy is that? He basically broke every commandment. Surely the Messiah is not going to come through him. He's going to come through the priestly family. And not your priest down in Jerusalem, but our priest here in Gerizim. And so they despised the Jews. That's why when Jesus tells the story of the Good Samaritan, it's so shocking to everyone. They thought of the Samaritans as people who hated Jews. In fact, most Jews wouldn't travel through Samaria because if their horse went lame, if their wagon broke, no one would help them. Now the Jews, for their part, despised the Samaritans. They considered them half-breeds. They considered them people who misrepresented the faith of Israel. They said that you were hauled off into bondage, and really, no Jews ever came back from that. You people are just pretending to be Jews. Now, their own Bible said otherwise. But when you're filled with prejudice, you tend to see the world the way you want to see it through that prejudice. It was so bad that it was illegal against the law for a Jew to share a cup, bowl, spoon, or ladle with a Samaritan. It was illegal to help a Samaritan woman when she was giving birth because you would be bringing another Samaritan into the world. It was so bad that every day the devout Pharisees would get up and in the last sentences of their daily prayer were sentences that went something like this: God, when the resurrection comes, be sure there are no Samaritans invited. Now that's a strong feeling, right? And so when Jesus says to the Pharisees, I'm sorry, boys, I gots to go. I'm going to Samaria. Everybody's eyebrows went up. And Jesus makes that journey to that place. Now in the Bible, geography is theology. You have to pay really close attention to where things happen because that's incredibly important. And John sets the story in this place because there is a message behind the location of the story. You see, we're here at Jacob's well. We're here where Joseph, his son, was buried. Now think back to the story of Joseph with the amazing technicolored coat, right? Joseph was sold off by his brothers into slavery. He gets hauled over to Egypt, the land of the Goyim, the unbelievers. And there God causes him to flourish. And he becomes a blessing to the Egyptian people and reveals God to them. And then eventually he's able to even bless the Jewish people. And it is to this place where he's buried that Jesus comes this day. Joseph represents one of Israel who went out into the foreign place and actually did the work of God and actually shared the hope that God wants to share with the world. And John is saying to us that Christ, by going to Samaria, is doing the same work Joseph did. He's going to the place no one wanted to go because if you're a person of faith, that's where God calls you to ministry, to the places no one wants to go, and to the people no one wants to see or befriend. And there Jesus meets a Samaritan woman. Of course, there's a cultural prohibition. Teachers like Jesus did not speak to women, especially women who were foreign. We all have excuses for why we don't speak to people, right? And sometimes we couch that in virtue. We make ourselves look, oh, I can't do that. I just don't want to be associated with those kinds of people. I don't want to be a part of what they're a part of. And it sounds so good, right? Jesus goes to the well that Jacob gave, the well by the burial place of Joseph. And he finds this woman there at noon. Now, I want to talk about her a few minutes. You see, there's a strain of prejudice that runs through the church, always has, probably always will, because we are made up of a body of believers, but also a body of sinners. And one of those prejudices is against women, particularly back in the time when the Bible was being translated. And the translators took a look at this story and said, oh, she's out there at noon. She must be somehow rejected by the community because women would go to gather water in the morning or gather water at night, but not at noon in the heat of the day. Well, that's true if you live in Europe where most of the translators lived. If you've ever been in the Middle East more than a couple of days, you know that the hottest part of the day is not noon at all, but what the Bible calls the ninth hour, about 3 o'clock. Sometimes you're just gathering water because you need water. Sometimes I do the laundry at 11:30 at night, not because I want to, but because that's just how the day rolls out. Right? Sometimes a task is just a task. And so she's there at noon. I think the timing that John is pointing about is not that she's somehow a social outcast, but that there is a right time for spiritual things to happen. That God has a timing for things that doesn't always meet our timing. I've been praying and praying and praying for a situation I know about that is heartbreaking. And months have gone by, and I prayed about that and said, God, why don't you take care of this and get this fixed, right? And finally this week, I got good news about that situation about which I've been praying, and it's taken months. But when that came, I realized that God has been able to work through that situation and has always been trying to help, but that all the players involved had to get to a place where they were spiritually ready to receive the healing that God was offering. Sometimes it's just about God's timing. And then the interpreters will say, well, look at her. She's had 5 husbands, and now she's living with someone who's not her husband in this very conservative Samaritan culture. Samaritans still live today. They're still very conservative. So she must be a little bit shady, right? Interesting that people would look at it that way. You know, when I look at this story, I read it as a pastor. John was a pastor. John was one of the first great pastors of the church. And what I see is a woman who's experienced the end of 5 relationships. We don't know if that happened because she was a widow 5 times, not unheard of in those ancient days when people didn't live very long. We don't know if she'd been divorced 5 times. We don't know if she'd had 5 unfaithful husbands. We don't know what happened. John intentionally doesn't tell us. All that he wants us to see is someone who is hurting. Someone who has experienced the brokenness of life. Someone who has endured the ending of their most primary relationships. And now, at least in this culture, is in a relationship that is, well, tedious at best. She's hurt and she's broken. And if you feel that way this morning, I want you to think about what Jesus really does in this story. He tells the religious authorities and the leaders, see you later, I've got something to do. And the Son of God crosses into Samaria to be with this woman who's hurting. And if this morning you feel like you're in Samaria, I want you to know that Christ is seeking you. That Christ longs to be with you, to love you, to affirm you, to bless you, and to renew you. Jesus tells her about living water, about a source of life that she can have and be renewed with. And it's no accident that John, as he tells us the story, a pastor to the church, wants us to make that connection, water, living water, and our baptism. To be the children of baptism, the children of water, are to be a people called into the Samarias of our own lives, to take the blessing of living water. What Jesus goes to Samaria to do is to give hope to someone who needs it. And think about the people in your life that you come across who need hope. And then something very interesting happens, right? The disciples show up, the gang of 12. You know, I don't know if they've been at the pizza shop. I don't know where they've been. I don't know if they've been getting Slurpees. I don't know, but they show up, right? And you've got to love how John tells the story. I mean, this is brilliant stuff from our friend John. John says, they didn't say, Lord, why are you with that woman? Lord, why are you seeing her? Lord, what are you doing with her? They didn't say, which is John's way of saying, they didn't say what they were thinking, right? Have you ever not said something, but you really are saying it inside your own head? And Jesus knows it. He knows why they're there. And he's delighted that they're shocked. Let me ask you a question. How long has it been since you did anything shocking for Jesus? How long has it been since you did anything that would shock the people around you in your world for your faith or because of your faith in Jesus Christ? How long has it been since you invited someone to church? How long has it been since you offered to pray with someone? How long has it been since you've been to Samaria? If your friends and the people know you're saying, what are you doing? Why are you going to that church? Why are you in that ministry? You're getting there, right? But if it's just business as usual, it's time to cross the borderline and go to Samaria. And then the story takes this interesting twist that a lot of people skip right at the end. The woman goes and she tells all of her friends in the village, leading me again to think she's not a shady character at all, because everybody in the village listens to her. They hear her experience with Jesus, and they come back to meet the Christ. Now here is Jesus, the Son of God, the Lord of the universe, who stood by God's side at the very creation of the world, who eventually will judge all of creation. He's a pretty busy guy. Got a lot on his agenda, right? And he's supposed to be going from Jerusalem to Galilee to start his ministry. And instead, John says he sat down, and what did he do? He spent the next few days with the Samaritans. Now let me just ask you, child of God, follower of Jesus, how long has it been since you spent time with the Samaritans? That night, the young couple went back to dinner and had a wonderful time with the old man and his daughter. And at the end of the dinner, some of the diners were shocked to see this beautiful young bride get up from the table, walk around the table, and kiss the scarred face of the old man she was dining with. Some of the diners turned away in disgust. Others stared in wonder. Amen.